This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz on world wars and America's entrance into these wars. So the time period that we're going to be looking at for the world wars includes the following. You're going to need to look at World War I, which stretches from 1914 to 1919. The Roaring Twenties, because it leads up to the Great Depression. That's 1920 to 1929. I want you to notice something, and this is very important for history. A lot of times when we talk about periods, we're not talking about the way that we would measure time usually. So you'd think of like the Roaring Twenties, well, that must be 1920 to 1930. But we don't talk about it that way. We talk about it thematically. And so 1920 is when we start to see the boom in the economy. 1929, when we see the crash of the stock market in the beginning of the Great Depression. So the Great Depression then goes from 1929 up to 1940. And then America gets involved in World War II in 1941. So 1940 is when Franklin Roosevelt starts to see the need for that involvement. And that goes up to 1945 with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. The point in the Princeton Review book, if you have the most updated version, 2016, is to look at the period of the beginning of the 20th century. That's pages 267 to 288. The First World War began due to European causes, and the European causes or European context had to do with European imperialism as well as European nationalism. Serbia at the time wanted independence from Austria-Hungary. There was a group within Serbia that was on the most radical end called the Black Hand, which was a Serbian terrorist group. And one of their members, Gavrilo Princips, went into Austria-Hungary and assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. Now, be careful with this. Most people oftentimes assume that this is what caused World War I to take place. That's not really the way historians look at it. They oftentimes will say that Gavrilo Princips, who assassinated Archduke Ferdinand, was the most what we call proximate cause, meaning it was the tipping point that led into World War I. But the truth was there were some major institutions that led up to this assassination that really were important in causing World War I. And one of the biggest ones is the alliance system. As soon as Gavrilo Princips did this, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. That then got Russia to then declare war on Austria-Hungary. Germany, who was an ally to Austria-Hungary, then declared war on Serbia and Russia. And then we started to see all the countries joining in with France. And then eventually Germany would invade through Belgium, which was neutral, and that got Great Britain to then get into the war as well. The United States did not get involved in the war. In fact, early on in 1916, President Wilson at the time ran on a position for the election of 1916 to keep us out of the war under a platform of what was called neutrality. In many ways, there were groups within the United States who wanted to push Wilson into the war. For example, the Irish and German immigrants wanted Wilson to support the Triple Alliance, the one that was between Germany and Austria and Hungary. Wilson eventually came to support the Triple Entente, and his reason for doing so was because he saw more of an affinity between the United States and the British when it came to free market issues, especially free market trade. And Wilson would eventually claim as well that America was a leader and that it was really our purpose to protect free trade and democracy within Central Europe against German autocracy. So why did we get involved in World War I? Probably one of the biggest reasons was the Germans' use of U-boat warfare. At the time, the Germans were the first ones to come up with what were known as U-boats, which would eventually morph into submarines much later. U-boat warfare was used by the Germans in order to create a blockade around Britain. But they began turning to what was called unrestricted U-boat warfare. This was where the Germans began sinking not only military ships, but also civilian ships as well. For example, the Germans sunk the Lusitania, a civilian luxury liner. The Germans also sunk the French ship, the Sussex, another civilian luxury liner. Wilson warned the Germans to stop attacking these civilian ships. Now, one thing to keep in mind, though, about this that makes this a lot more complicated. The Lusitania was a civilian luxury liner, but the British had started using a new strategy. All the fighting that was taking place over in France, especially northern France. And so what the British were doing was they were hiding military weapons inside of these luxury liners. And in that way, they would be able to get them past the blockade, since they weren't military goods, onto the mainland. Well, the Germans found out about this, and they began sinking these luxury liners. So when Wilson claimed that the Germans needed to stop this because they were attacking civilian ships, the Germans responded that really they were just dealing with the British strategy of trying to sneak things over past the blockade. But probably the other big reason why we got involved had to deal with something called the Zimmermann letter. The British intercepted a letter from the German ambassador Zimmermann to Mexico. And what the Zimmermann letter did was asked Mexico to join Germany and begin attacking the United States. The Germans were afraid that the United States might get involved, and if the U.S. got involved, especially on the British side, it would tip the balance in favor of the British. And so they made this request that Mexico would kind of keep us at bay by starting to attack us, and by doing that, it would kind of bog us down, and that when the war was over, the Germans would be able to then negotiate a treaty with North America in which we would have to return the southwest of North America to Mexico. Now, Mexico never agreed to this. In fact, Mexico did not even receive the letter. But what this pointed out to the Americans in the American Congress was that there was an attempt at a violation of American sovereignty by the Germans. So at that point, we declared war on Germany, and when we did so, right after that, Wilson established the National Defense Act of 1916, which started up a draft. May of 1917, the Selective Service put the draft into effect. Most of the draftees came from the poor, the uneducated, and lower classes. And in fact, this is really important long-term for understanding the issue of the draft in American politics. The first draft was done during the Civil War. This is now our second draft. We'll see another one in World War II. But notice in each one of these drafts, what happens is that there are ways for the wealthy to get out of these drafts. Oftentimes they would pay somebody else, or when we get up to Vietnam, they could go to college and in that way be able to defer their service. And so most of the time draftees were coming from the poorer classes, and that oftentimes would cause a lot of dissent and anger towards these policies. However, Wilson did have a way in which he was going to gain public support, and the way he did it was through propaganda, which was a tool at this time that was used in all the major countries. Wilson did this by creating something called the Committee on Public Organization, which was run by George Creel. Creel worked with Hollywood in order to demonize the Germans, and what they did was, instead of just creating movies about the war, they created movies that made the Germans ultra enemies, or the big other, some kind of demonic force. For example, the Beast of Berlin and To Hell with the Kaiser. Even common words ended up being changed. For example, sauerkraut became freedom cabbage. They also changed hamburger into liberty meat. So there were all these changes made even to just normal types of words in order to try and get people against Germans and Germanic culture. As far as the economy during the war, the government started to work with the private sector in order to try to gain economic support for the war. A group was started called the War Industry Boards, which was headed by Bernard Baruch, and he began to set limits and quotas on production. Wilson also created the National War Labor Board, in which he worked with unions in order to keep wages high, but to stop the unions from going on strikes. Wilson was also known for silencing dissenters. So this became a very controversial point of Wilson's presidency. He was able to get past the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which stated that their major purpose was to stop people from lying, but the law was worded so vaguely that anybody who basically disagreed with the war effort faced the possibility of going to prison. And this actually did happen. The IWW, or the International Workers of the World, was the most radical union within America at the time. They supported socialism. And their leader, Eugene Debs, was imprisoned because he came out against the war and claimed that this was a war basically about imperialism. In the Supreme Court case, Schenck versus US, the Supreme Court upheld the Espionage and Sedition Acts, arguing that while free speech was a freedom that all Americans enjoyed, that during a time of war, that context changed and gave some limitations to free speech. So in the middle of this war, we start to see limitations put upon freedoms and liberties. And this has been a big question ever since when it comes to wars for America, is how much are we going to accept of restrictions at home when these types of wars take place? On top of that, a Red Scare took place as well. In the middle of the war, in 1917, the Bolsheviks succeeded in making Russia into a communist country. Now, you got to understand for this time period how significant this was. This would almost be like a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda being able to turn large sections of the Middle East into radical Islam. At the time, nobody thought communism could actually become a dominant force in Europe, and yet here it did. The Bolsheviks took over Russia and made it into communist, and that was the fear at that point in the United States, that new incoming immigrants would be able to export this communism into the United States. So in 1919, the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, began arresting immigrants on a mass basis, suspecting them of being communists. Now, when we think about it, this is really rather strange at the time. The Communist Party at that time period only had 70,000 people in it. There was a Communist Party in the United States, still is today, only had 70,000 people. Socialists at the time only had 30,000 people in it. Now, that might sound like big numbers, 100,000 people who believe in some kind of left-wing overall belief system. But when you consider that at the time there were about 100 million people in America, this is not even 1% of the population. It's a very small group. So you can see this fear that is spreading that really doesn't have much of a basis in reality. So when the war is all done, what ends up happening is that the United States has to rebuild Europe. And in that European context, the United States banker Charles Dawes developed a solution to international trade. He decided that the US banks would start lending money to Germany in order to industrialize. Germany would then take that money, repay back any of its loans, and encourage economic growth. And this would start to encourage international trade in Germany. And because they're paying back so many loans and for the war effort in Britain and France, it would start to build up the rest of Europe as well. However, the Great Depression hits in 1928, and when it does so, it crashes the American banks, and that is going to crash the European context. When that is crashed, two alternatives arose within Europe. They were the radical challenges to capitalism and democracy, and it's communism and fascism. Now, communism had succeeded in Russia. However, most of Europe was going to reject it, primarily because of atheism. And the rest of Europe, most people were traditionally either Christian, Protestant, or Christian Catholic. They were not going to accept an atheistic philosophy like communism. And in Germany, this is especially true. Northern Germany is traditionally Protestant. Southern Germany around Munich is traditionally Catholic. German traditional beliefs and religious faith led to a rejection of both communism. Well, it led to a rejection of communism, but an acceptance of fascism because fascism preached traditional values and the notion of a strong central leader. So that brings in Adolf Hitler. Hitler preached a return of German nationalism and then expansion over Europe. Hitler was able to then turn and blame the loss of World War I on the Jews and the German government and military. Now, between World War I and World War II, there was a socialist parliamentary government that had formed called the Weimar Republic. And he claimed that the people who were in charge, both during the war and during the Weimar Republic, were largely Jewish people who had sold out the German government and German nation. So he attempted to do a violent revolution to take over the German nation, and he did this through what's called the Beer Hall Push. Down in Munich, there's a famous beer hall. He went to that beer hall and gave a big speech, and then after that they walked through the central streets of Munich in the hope of taking it over and then marching up to Berlin. However, the streets in that area are very narrow, and it was very easy for the police to cordon off the area and to stop his revolution from happening. So they took him to prison, and while he was in prison, he began to realize that he had it all wrong. He actually had a far better solution for what he needed to do. Instead of doing a violent revolution, he needed to simply run for political office. And that's what he did. He ran for political office and won the chancellor position in Germany. Once he was in that position, he took individual events that took place, many of which he instigated himself, and then scapegoated the Jews, claiming that they were creating an internal emergency, either Jews or communists. In doing that, he gained more and more power and eventually unified German support behind him. Now, at that point, he had an overall economic plan. We oftentimes forget this because so much of the focus is put on the horrible evil that he did to the Jewish people. But we forget what he did in a sort of like positive sense for Germans that appealed to them and allowed him to get away with the monstrous evil that he did. And what he did was he militarized the economy. He began giving people jobs in order to build up as many military weapons as possible. And when you do something like that temporarily, your economy is going to boom. And he did that. He dropped unemployment to 2%. Now, if you want to compare that to something, compare that to the United States at the time of the Great Depression. We had anywhere from a 19 to a 25% unemployment rate. So this was a huge success for Germany. However, there's also a downside to this. Once you militarize the economy, what are you going to do with your military weapons? It's not like you can go out on the streets and drive tanks all day. Tanks are not consumer goods that you can just sell off to people. You need to use them for something. And the way that you use them, of course, is to take things over. And that's what Hitler wanted to do. He started using this massive military that he had used in order to take over most of Europe. First, he annexed Austria, not through military, but through a fixed election. He then invaded Czechoslovakia. Then he turned northwards and took over Poland. And by this time, Britain and France realized the danger that they were facing and declared war on Germany. But it really was too late at that point. Germany's momentum and Germany's strength was so strong that they were able to defeat Britain and France at that invasion and then take over France itself. So this then leads up to the American involvement. And just like in World War I, between World War I and World War II, America had decided to become more neutral. America and European populations really saw after World War I the problem of global wars. They did not want to get involved in another major global war, and they began agreeing in pacifist types of reactions and neutral reactions. For example, they agreed to the Kellogg-Briand Act, promising not to declare war or advance war unless they were directly attacked. America also agreed to something called the Washington Naval Conference, which promised to limit the production of naval battleships. However, while the overall emphasis and motivation of this was to reduce the amount of weapons that were being produced in order to reduce the amount of conflict in the world, what it just did was the Allies, Britain, France, and the United States, reduced their stockpile of weapons, their stockpile of naval goods, and Japan and Germany started to boost their development of their naval goods. So in the end, it just ended up creating parity or equality between all these countries, and that allowed Japan and Germany to gain power. So American foreign policy. FDR during this time period was primarily pursuing international foreign trade. So he had a position of neutrality when it came to military issues. He was pursuing foreign trade when it came to economic issues. For example, he began working on what was called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements, which was an agreement between Latin America and the United States to lower trade tariffs. He also began establishing the Good Neighbor policy, which promised that the United States would not pursue colonies overseas. The primary example of this is under Franklin Roosevelt, the Philippines. After the Spanish-American War, they had been annexed underneath our protection. Now they were finally given their independence. When it came to fascism, FDR treated fascism really as just a European problem. For example, there was a fascist civil war that took place in Spain, in which the fascist leader, Francisco Franco, was up against what were called the Republicans, who were attempting to keep Spain from becoming fascist. Franklin Roosevelt stayed out of this conflict, and in fact, at one point, Francisco Franco called FDR a gentleman for having stayed out of the conflict. FDR later came to see what a mistake this had been, and that fascism really was a threat to democracy, free trade, and human rights. So now what his big problem was how was he going to convince an isolationist American public to see the threat? So what FDR realized by 1940 was that we had to get involved. He just didn't know quite at this point how he was going to get the American public to buy into this. And so what he did was he began to get us in slowly. For example, through the Lend-Lease program, Americans lent or leased military weapons to the British. FDR also created a draft before the war started, in which he started to introduce the ability to have some people enter into the war. And he also created a voluntary force secretly in order to enter into the war. And this is the strange part most people forget. About a few weeks before the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor, there was actually an article that came out in the major newspapers where it was discovered that FDR was setting up this secret voluntary force. And everybody in America was just really upset about this because they knew once we sent troops over, it really would get us into the war. And then just a couple weeks later, the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor, and nobody remembers that article anymore because it became so clear that we had to enter into the war. So with Pearl Harbor and its aftermath, the reason why Pearl Harbor had become so important was Japan had been invading into Manchuria in order to gain control of the Asian region. And they had established something that they called the Asian Co-Prosperity Zone, which they claimed was going to be a way to free Asians from European control. In reality, all it did was replace European imperialists with Japanese imperialists. In fact, the Japanese used Koreans, Chinese, and Vietnamese as their own slaves. Sometimes the slavery was for manual labor, and sometimes, in the case of women, it was used for sex slaves during the war. The problem for Japan was they needed oil, and America was the market for their oil. And America had frozen the oil supplies and would not allow Japan to get access to it. And that's what caused Japan to decide that they were going to attack at Pearl Harbor. So once that happens, America declares war on Japan. Japan's ally, Germany, declares war on America, so we declare war on Germany, and now we need a strategy to deal with this. For the first 6 months, America lost battle after battle after Pearl Harbor. They eventually even lost the Philippines as the Japanese took it over, and then when the Japanese took it over, they marched Americans and other people who had been conquered 300 miles north in the Philippines in the tropical weather there during what's called the Bataan Death March. American leaders then had to decide on a strategy, and they decided on two major strategies to turn the war. So in the European case, the strategy was a strategy through northern Africa. And the idea was this: the Allies would attack first through northern Africa and remove the Italian allies. While this happened, it was expected that the Soviet Union would continue to attack from the east, and so they would draw the German fire. Now, the idea really behind this for FDR and Churchill was that this would make it harder and harder on the Germans and eventually isolate them. However, Stalin, who agreed to the strategy, was worried that what the US and Britain were really after was a way to weaken both Germany and the Soviet Union so that after the war was done, the communists would be weakened. In the Pacific, Douglas MacArthur developed what was known as island hopping. This was the idea that America would attack the satellites of Japan first, not Japan itself. Over time, as Japan got cut off and isolated and lost most of its satellite areas, eventually Japan would be so weak that the US could attack Japan directly. Now, while all of this is happening, some major changes were taking place on the United States home front. And probably, in some ways, this is a part of U.S. history I think is so important because it's such a huge turning point in what happens in the United States from here on out. Roosevelt industrialized the military economy on the home front, and this is really going to help us win the war. In fact, it's known that when the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor, they had 3 waves that they were going to attack with. In the first wave, they got us off guard, and it worked very well for them. The second wave that took place was meant to destroy as many of the U.S. battleships as possible, which worked. And then there was supposed to be a third wave in which the Japanese would come, and not only would they take out the rest of our fleet in the Pacific, but they would begin attacking the continent itself. And the admiral at the time for the Japanese Navy decided not to do this. And at the end of this, he said, part of the reason why he chose not to do this was he realized that they had woken the sleeping giant. Well, what do they mean by the sleeping giant? Well, because America is this massive industrial country. It's all connected together in one continent. And if you get that going, you really have almost like this infinite supply of military goods. And that's exactly what happened. The federal government began subsidizing factories to produce military goods. It led to a 1.2% unemployment rate. What's really important is who got attracted into these central industrial cities. African Americans and women were attracted into these cities and factories, moved out of the South, moved out of rural farmlands. This would change America demographically for the rest of the 20th century. From here on out, African Americans and women had more economic opportunities. They were moved away from southern areas where there was more discrimination. They had more of an opportunity for higher education. World War II opened massive possibilities for minority groups in order to gain more and more rights in America. So at the same time, while minority rights were beginning to be expanded, there was also vast violations of minority rights. And the best example of this was FDR's Executive Order 9066, which interned the Japanese during World War II over a fear of espionage. The internment of the Japanese led to Japanese families losing their property and never getting them back until in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan would apologize for what America had done and give reparations to the Japanese. In the famous court case Korematsu versus the United States, Korematsu challenged this U.S. action, but the Supreme Court upheld it as a case of national emergency. Also during this time period, Franklin Roosevelt turned away the ship called the St. Louis, which carried Jewish refugees who were seeking asylum from what Hitler and Germany was doing. Many countries within the West turned away the Jews, and FDR did so as well because of the anti-Semitism within the U.S. Congress. So the end of the war. American and British forces eventually did defeat the German troops in northern Africa, and this allowed them to isolate and then take out Italy. Once that was done, America and Britain could then invade through Normandy while the Soviet Union invaded Germany from the east. This two-front war eventually did work and defeated the Germans just as the strategy had said that it was going to. And that then led for the ability to focus in on Japan. FDR attended the Yalta Conference that made the final plans for the war in Europe, and when he returned home, he suffered a stroke and died. His Vice President, Harry Truman, then took over the office and met with Joseph Stalin about the war in Japan. At the Potsdam Conference, Truman was told that the U.S. had successfully tested the atomic bomb. Now, he was told this right after the Soviets agreed to enter into the Pacific part of the war, and this is where we get into that big controversy over why the atomic bombs were actually dropped. Truman decided to use the atomic bomb, and he always claimed that he did so in order to end the war and save lives. Truman's justification was that the Japanese were so loyal to their emperor, they were willing to fight to the end in order to avoid having to lose their honor. Later, his critics would argue that the war would have ended if the U.S. had just cooperated with the Soviets and they had invaded Japan together. Also, they argued that Japan probably would have given in to the desire to surrender if they had just been given a conditional surrender, in which the Japanese would get to retain their emperor. When the war was all done, the Allies put the German leaders on trial for their crimes against humanity. It was the first time this ever happened in the globe. Usually when somebody lost a war, it was understood. Countries declare wars all the time. You just make a treaty and move on. This was the first time, though, that there was an international recognition. There was such a violation of human rights with the Jewish Holocaust and with what the Germans did to so many other minority groups that they were put on trial. Also, the United States took leadership and founded the United Nations, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank in order to create an international economy with international economic rules to stop a Great Depression from ever happening. So some conclusions to look at then from Americans' involvement in the two world wars. The first one is this: World War I was viewed by American policymakers and its allies as being a global crisis, but due to weapons production and alliances over European imperialism in places like Africa, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. The solution at the time seemed to be to create an international institution that would create political rules that would lower the amount of weapons production, create more free trade, and have a place for diplomacy based around a concept known as collective security. So the League of Nations was created as a way for countries to come together, create political rules, and try to keep any one nation from stepping out of control and therefore trying to create the instability within the global system. The United States viewed the Second World War, though, quite differently. The Second World War was seen as a product of an economic collapse with the Great Depression. So there we do have international institutions created, but this is where people oftentimes get confused and think the League of Nations is the same as the United Nations. Somewhat true, the United Nations is a place for collective security as well as global diplomacy, but the real big institutions that have power at this time period are created at the Bretton Woods Conference, and those are the IMF and the World Bank. And so the solution was really seen as a way to create international institutions that would promote development and free trade through lowered tariffs, and that then leads us into the period afterwards in the United States and the globe of globalization of free trade.